and a memo if you're associated with a university stating which insects and where you were allowed to collect them. One other main thing on this slide that I'd like to reiterate is you must get Fish and Wildlife clearance for all shipments prior to CBP clearance. That is a violation of 50 CFR if you obtain customs clearance prior to Fish and Wildlife clearance. Now, this, if you are an example, like I said earlier, if you're carrying some insects through the IAH terminal and there's not a Fish and Wildlife inspector present, Customs may give you a provisional clearance. They will release you with the items, but this is not a CBP clearance per se prior to Fish and Wildlife. So there's you want to definitely let a Fish and Wildlife officer know prior to your shipment to avoid any penalties. Next slide, please. This is an example of a declaration package with your CITES is on the top there. Check if required. The eDoc has a spot after you submitted it to pay your inspection fee via credit card. But the package should also include the invoice, any other permits. If it is a cargo shipment, it'll have an airway bill. If it's a commercial shipment, you're going to have that the fourth document back there, the import-export license, and you may have a customs entry document. Next slide, please. Now let's get into if you need a license. This permit is generally required for all individuals or businesses that engage in business as an importer or exporter of wildlife. This permit, which is valid for 1 year, must be acquired from the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service. We have a link to that, I believe, attached to this PowerPoint, and it is filed electronically now, and it is a $100 fee, and it is good for the year. You also, if you are not coming to the Port of Houston, you may need a port exemption permit. This includes for scientific purposes, and those are some examples of when you would need that port exemption permit. That port exemption permit is valid for 2 years. Next slide, please. All right, this is good slide. International import-export for non-commercial scientific or educational purpose. Wildlife imported or exported for bona fide scientific or educational purposes is typically exempt from Fish and Wildlife import-export license regulations. This includes museum-to-museum exchange, researcher importing specimens for a university study, if it's not for commercial, scientific, or educational purpose. Next slide, please. Here's the hyperlink to the file, that eDoc. You get you create a username and password, and also on that page will the next slide will show how to fill out that declaration. The instruction sheet is attached to this that eDoc site as well. Next slide, please. So we're not going to go through each block that's required on the eDoc or the 3-177 declaration form, but here's a good reference. If you have any questions, you can come back to this slide or call your local wildlife inspector, and they'll be happy to help you if you have any questions filling this out. Basically, you want to get as much information as you can from your shipment, from your CITES, from your airway bill, and fill out this as much as you can to get it submitted so a wildlife inspector can see it. You can always log back in and make changes to this eDec. It's an adjustable online form. Next slide, please. Again, this is some more instructions on filling out that eDec. Next slide, please. And finishing up, the probably most critical is putting if it's scientific or commercial, how it was collected. If it was collected from the wild or if it was captive bred species. Next slide, please. Next slide, please. All right. Failure to file a declaration for importation or exportation of fish or wildlife when required by regulation 50 CFR is a violation of the Endangered Species Act. I get lots of questions. Well, they're not endangered species. Well, the Endangered Species Act is what gives us the regulation to enforce that declaration requirement. Next slide, please. eScan program. So after you filed your eDec, it'll ask you if you'd like to eScan your documents. There you can choose one PDF file to upload all of your document package into one PDF file, and we can see those documents and verify that you have all of the documents required for import or export. Next slide, please. Up at the top, highlighted is our email, fws_ole houston@fws.gov. All the wildlife inspectors can view this email and respond accordingly. If you have any problems with your eDec, you can call a wildlife inspector. The help desk number is at the bottom there. Next slide, please. There you go. When in doubt, call an inspector. There's our office hours and our email again. I see. Do we have any questions?
Yeah, Mr. Hunt, there are a couple of questions here that you may have covered, but if you could clarify. One from Adaremi Dasumu asked, do primate serum samples for research purposes require a fish and wildlife permit? And if exempt, how do you document that?
No, they're not exempt. They do require the CITES permit and declaration form. If it is for commercial purposes, then they will need the import-export license. If it's for research, we'll have to verify that. But if they are planning on importing monkey serum, please contact a local wildlife inspector and we can walk them through the process and make sure that they're doing the right thing.
Okay, thank you, sir. And just one more question, if you could clarify this one from Marie-Louise Faber asks, are import of research animals regulated and use the same permit as domestic animals?
Research animals regulated and use the same permits. Just, research animals regulated. Yes, if they are from a wild descent, it just depends on the species. So that's one we'd need to know the exact species that was being imported, and then we could dive a little further into which permits they're referring to. So it just depends on that one. If it's a wild species, then they'll need an export permit and to file the eDec and to have a license if it's commercial, non-wild.
Okay.
Okay.
Yep. Yeah, and she did a follow-up. Are imported research mice regulated, not non-wild?
No, no. Research mice are not regulated by Fish and Wildlife. They fall under the domestic species. Yeah, so
Okay,
there's no.
okay. Very good. And from Rebecca Maloney asks, are bat specimens regulated by Fish and Wildlife Service, or does it vary with species?
Yes, yes. All bat specimens are regulated by Fish and Wildlife, and they need to file the declaration form and have all of their permits. They're also regulated by CDC, so they'll need to have CDC approval as well. But yes, bat specimens do require Fish and Wildlife declaration. And like I said, if it is commercial, they need that import-export license. And depending on the species, they may need a CITES permit.
Okay, very good. Yeah, and she wrote in there it's for research.
Okay, so no license is required, most likely.
Okay, very good. If anybody else has a question, please go ahead and type it in now. Okay, I'm not seeing anything right now. Mary, are you seeing any questions on your end?
No, not seeing any more questions in the box.
Okay, yeah, thank you, Mr. Hunt, for your presentation.
No problem. Thank you for having me.
All right, we made it through day one. We did cover a lot of ground. I do want to say thank you to the speakers. The presentations were great. Good job. I do want to clarify on sending out copies of the PowerPoint slides. So because of the size of these PowerPoints and the number of these PowerPoints, we will not send them out to all participants. We would ask that you request the slides. So if you've registered for this workshop, please contact Jenny Lingen and request the slides that you need sent to you. If you joined with a link that was sent to you from someone else, we request that you request the slides in the chat box and provide your email at that time. So thank you all for attending. I know we threw a lot of information out to you. Day two starts at 10 o'clock Central Daylight Time tomorrow. Again, it'll go 10 to 2, and we'll have more speakers and more ground to cover. Thank you so much and have a good evening.
Thank you, Mary. Great job.
Thanks, Mary.
Thank you, Mary.